A delivery truck rattles past a window, while a driver across town tries to recall the quickest route through a maze of one-way streets. Two recent articles treat this everyday urban grid as a hidden medical variable. A report in Smithsonian Magazine explores how the constant stress of traffic noise might slowly increase the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. From a different angle, a piece in The Conversation suggests the active mental challenge of figuring out complicated routes actually acts as a workout for the mind, potentially delaying Alzheimer's. Something interesting emerges when placing these ideas side by side. It shows how the exact same city environment can both wear the brain down and build it up. Living next to a busy road means sleeping through the steady rush of passing cars. An article published last week in Smithsonian Magazine treats that chronic traffic noise as an invisible physical stressor, one that actually increases a person's risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Pay attention to the massive scale of the evidence required to catch this connection. The piece outlines how researchers had to map the addresses and hospital records of 3.1 million adults across Denmark over 18 years.
Long-term exposure to road traffic noise might increase your risk of developing Parkinson's disease, new research suggests. A study that examined 3.1 million adults in Denmark across 18 years found a modest but consistent correlation. The findings hint that disruptive environmental sounds are a credible risk factor for the brain disorder. Dealing with traffic is more than just annoying. It can disrupt your sleep cycle and increase your stress, with impacts on your health. Now, new research hints that long-term exposure to the sounds might also raise the risk of Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a progressive brain disorder that affects more than 11 million people around the world, which is expected to more than double by 2050 as people increasingly live longer. This trend underscores the need to identify the modifiable risks of the disease. After following 3.1 million Danish participants, ages 40 and older, over the course of 18 years, researchers have found a modest but consistent correlation between the level of traffic noise exposure and the risk of developing the neurodegenerative disease. The new work, described in the journal JAMA Neurology on July 20, represents the largest study of its kind. Chronic noise is still a young entrant in the Parkinson's disease risk factor literature, says study co-author Thomas Munzel, an environmental cardiologist at the University Medical Center Mainz in Germany, to Ushika Kidd at The Guardian. So the findings should spur further research on a link between disruptive sounds and the brain disorder. Need to know: Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a progressive disorder with motor symptoms including tremors, slowed movement, rigid muscles, and poor balance.
It's caused by the death of nerve cells in the brain that produce the chemical messenger dopamine, which is important for controlling movement. In 2025, researchers reported that exposure to loud noises can produce motor deficits in mice whose brains were altered to mimic Parkinson's disease. Previous, smaller studies in Canada and the Netherlands also found a relationship between traffic noise and the disease. The new work goes a step further, since it includes data from a much larger cohort and accounts for possible influences of other variables, like socioeconomic status and environmental factors, says Jeanette Rodriguez Palares, a neurobiologist at the University of Santiago de Compostela who wasn't involved in the research, in expert commentary compiled by Spain's Science Media Center. For the study, Munzel and colleagues analyzed whether participants developed Parkinson's between 2000 and 2017 using the Danish National Patient Register, which records discharge diagnoses of all patients admitted to hospitals. The health information was cross-referenced with estimated road traffic noise levels on different sides of the participants' dwellings. The team also adjusted for factors including age, sex, income, education, and whether individuals lived with other people, which were acquired from national registers. Nearly 20,600 participants developed the neurodegenerative disease over the study period. Analyses revealed that for every 11.5 decibel increase in traffic noise on the most exposed facade of a home, the risk of Parkinson's went up 3%. On the side least exposed to car sounds, every 9 dB increase of noise raised the risk of Parkinson's by 4%.
Having a 10 decibel noise level difference between these sides of the residence helped mitigate the risks, the team found. The link between traffic noise and Parkinson's disease remained consistent across various demographic, environmental, and socioeconomic factors. These findings suggest that road traffic noise may be a novel environmental risk factor for Parkinson's, reads an accompanying editorial by experts who were not involved in the study. While the study didn't look at how noise might increase risk of disease, previous work suggests that disruptive sounds can disturb sleep and trigger a stress response that increases the production of reactive oxygen species. These molecules can cause cellular damage in the brain and seem to play a role in Parkinson's. Although it is unlikely that noise directly causes the death of nerve cells, it may impair the brain's protective mechanisms and promote biological processes involved in disease development, Rodriguez Polares says in the commentary. Anna Hansel, an environmental epidemiologist at the University of Leicester in England, tells The Guardian that noise was more likely to be a general stressor than a specific environmental risk factor for Parkinson's disease. The study design also doesn't prove causation, says Hansel, who wasn't involved in the study. Still, the findings highlight the importance of addressing noise pollution and its impact on public health. In Europe, 1 in 5 people are estimated to be exposed to harmful levels of traffic noise. Ensuring that everyone has access to a quiet corner in their home may be important for reducing the potential neurodegenerative effects of chronic noise exposure, the authors write in the study.
The Smithsonian piece leaves you looking at the street outside your window as a slow, invisible hazard. The constant hum of traffic acts as a passive force wearing down the brain over decades, quietly increasing the risk of Parkinson's. Read alongside Hatim Sharif up next. That view of the city flips. Sharif looks at the exact same chaotic streets, but sees a completely different neurological effect. Where the first piece measures the damage of passively absorbing city noise, Sharif looks at the protective power of actively mastering city geography. He points to taxi and ambulance drivers who spend their days building complex mental maps on the fly. The interesting thing is how both writers treat the everyday urban environment as a medical variable. The city isn't just a backdrop, it physically reshapes the brain. But while the roar of traffic might slowly degrade nerve cells, the mental workout of figuring out how to bypass that same traffic seems to build a defense against Alzheimer's. Put the two together, and the streets outside look less like a fixed setting and more like a physical test, one that either wears the mind down with noise or strengthens it through the effort of finding a way through.
Taxi and ambulance drivers are less likely than workers in almost any other job to die of Alzheimer's disease. That was the surprising result of a 2024 study examining the death certificates of nearly 9 million people in the U.S. These findings stopped me in my tracks because those two jobs rely on the same thing as my own work: maps. I have spent more than 2 decades staring at maps. Not paper maps on a wall, but digital ones with multiple layers, flood boundaries draped over census blocks, car crash hotspots plotted against road geometry, and satellite readings of rainfall stitched across river basins. Much of my work as a civil and environmental engineer is done through GIS, that is, Geographic Information Systems. Engineers like me hold several spatial relationships in their minds at once, reasoning about where things sit relative to one another across scales ranging from a city block to a whole watershed. I always assumed that spatial reasoning across map layers was purely professional, but that study on taxi and ambulance drivers made me wonder whether all that mental work might be doing something good to the brain. Taxi driver brains. Of the 9 million death certificates from January 2020 to December 2022 that researchers examined, taxi and ambulance drivers had the lowest risk of dying from Alzheimer's disease out of 443 occupations. After adjusting for age, sex, race, ethnicity, and education, roughly 1 in 100 taxi and ambulance drivers died of Alzheimer's, compared with 1 in 60 people overall. This pattern did not extend to other driving jobs. The researchers concluded that the key to reducing the risk of Alzheimer's was not driving itself, but continuous real-time navigation, the constant work of locating yourself in space, tracking a destination, and updating a mental map as conditions change. Drivers whose jobs relied on fixed or predetermined routes, like bus drivers and aircraft pilots, didn't seem to experience a similar advantage. Researchers believe the association between navigation-heavy work and lower Alzheimer's risk centers on the hippocampus, a part of the brain that governs memory and spatial navigation. It's one of the first brain regions that Alzheimer's damages. Problems with spatial navigation and orientation are among the earliest signs of the disease, sometimes surfacing before obvious memory loss. In one landmark 2000 study, neuroscientists compared the brains of licensed London taxi drivers with those of people who did not drive cabs. Their findings provided the first evidence, via structural imaging, that regions of the adult brain can measurably change under sustained navigational demand. To earn a license, London cabbies must memorize more than 25,000 streets within a 6-mile radius of Charing Cross, a challenge known as the knowledge that takes 3 to 4 years. The researchers found that London taxi drivers had measurably more gray matter in the posterior hippocampus, a brain area tied to storing large-scale spatial maps. That volume tracked with experience. The longer someone had driven, the larger that part of the brain. The change was built through practice, not inherited. While people who are good at navigation might gravitate to this kind of job, the job itself does have an impact on the brain. Together, these two studies make a coherent case. Work that intensively exercises the hippocampus may reshape it, and that reshaping may protect against one of the most feared diseases of aging. Where map specialists fit in. Cartographers, urban planners, and geospatial analysts spend their working days in sustained spatial reasoning. A geographic information system specialist might use a computer to overlap population data on flood exposure maps to find who is at risk, or read satellite imagery to map land cover after a wildfire. Researchers juggle several layers of data, coordinate systems, and scales at once. Does spatial reasoning through a screen engage the hippocampus the way moving through a real city does? While a taxi driver navigates from inside the scene at street level, GIS researchers picture space from above as a map, what cognitive scientists call allocentric reasoning. But these two perspectives overlap in the brain. The hippocampus also builds maps from outside viewpoints, not just from a navigator's own position. Research on cognitive maps points toward the same conclusion as the study on taxi drivers. In 2023, researchers ran a machine learning model on more than 22,500 people in a national dataset and were able to predict which zip codes had higher rates of Alzheimer's with 84% accuracy based on how complex the environment was. Those living in spatially complex surroundings, the kind that force active map building, such as dense street networks with numerous intersections, diverse points of interest and landmarks, and multiple path options, were less likely to develop Alzheimer's. A follow-up study tied geospatial complexity in one's environment to greater volume in the brain's spatial navigation regions. The researchers hypothesized that routinely building cognitive maps exercises the very circuitry that Alzheimer's attacks first. Repeatedly engaging the cognitive systems involved in spatial navigation could help delay symptoms of disease. However, these two studies focus on where people live, not the work people do. Whether spatial reasoning through a screen exercises the same circuitry as real-life city navigation remains untested. Protecting your brain. The implications of whether sustained spatial reasoning protects the brain reach beyond map makers and cab drivers. Studies have repeatedly found a link between mentally complex occupations and delayed cognitive decline and lower dementia risk, even after accounting for education. Research on cognitive reserve, the brain's capacity to continue functioning despite disease, can help explain why two people with a similar disease burden can show markedly different levels of cognitive impairment. If demanding spatial thinking protects the brain, then how societies design schooling, professional training, and retirement all become questions of brain health. Spatial reasoning can be trained, and training opportunities are already widespread. GIS and remote sensing instruction are available through geography, engineering, public health, and environmental science programs worldwide. If sustained engagement with spatial reasoning can help the brain strengthen the circuitry that Alzheimer's attacks first, its value reaches well beyond the technical skills it builds.
What lingers is the realization that a city block is never just concrete and glass. The daily commute, the roar of a passing truck, The confusing turn down an unfamiliar alley is quietly rewiring the brain over decades. A neighborhood acts like a slow-drip medical treatment, wearing the mind down with noise or building it up through the effort of finding the way home. The question left to sit with is one of design. If human memory needs deep quiet to stay safe, but a healthy dose of friction to stay sharp, what does the perfect street actually look like?